Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tele-Aviacion, and welcome to This Week in El Salvador. I'll tell you something, the exchanges are wrangling. It all has to do with exchanges. Exchanges that exchange Bitcoin for dollars, exchange Terra Luna for Bitcoin or dollars, or exchange Ethereum for Bitcoin or exchange them for dollars. That's on the altcoin front. The other exchanges, exchanging dollars for francs, dollars for marks, dollars for pesos. The exchanges are wrangling, every one of them. What does that mean? They are making deals. They are doing a lot of work these days. And this is probably a bigger deal than even all of the inflation we have been talking about. So let's talk about this inflation. Generally, inflation is about prosperity. Now, I apologize. I live in a world where I meet people and have normal contact with many people, and none of them have been telling me that they've been buying new cars or new houses or all sorts of other merchandise, new equipment, new cameras, new computers. That has not been a big issue. Well, generally, in periods of high inflation, that generally means more prosperity. And in fact, there's an inverse proportion. The more inflation you have, the less unemployment you have. That's not necessarily the case. There's still a decent amount of unemployment. Why? Well, probably still left over from the pandemic. There's still a certain amount of people that just don't want to work. But people are starting to want to go back to work again, and there are jobs for them. When you look at, look at the stock market. Well, yes, a lot of money has been pumped into the stock market. Is that a sign of inflation because the stock market has been going down? Well, I guess you could say it's a type of inflation, but really what it has to do with is the price of oil. Now, what happened with oil? About 2 years ago, oil went down to zero. So is it any wonder that the oil companies are trying to make back every bit of potential profit that they lost during that time? Because believe me, that was a big time. They had to shut a lot of oil wells down. They have to put them back up again. Not to mention that it's an opportunity for the oil companies to make a lot of money by charging excessive profits, or taking excessive profits and charging excessive amounts of money. By the way, in El Salvador, the fuel is about $4.15 a gallon, and the diesel fuel is about $4.09 a gallon. Try to see if you can see that in any Western country. Good luck. But again, back to this issue, it is the crisis exacerbated the fuel issue, the crisis through Russia and Ukraine. But even that should not stop. I mean, there's no question Saudi Arabia could pump out more oil if they wanted. We could finally make that deal with Venezuela that we've been talking about, but of course, no news on that. In other words, it almost appears as if the present administration wants it to be this way. Why would they want things to be this way, where they are now all of a sudden they're raising their interest rates. They're theoretically lowering the amount of money. They're not doing the quantitative easing that they were doing. Why would they want to do that? Well, a good reason that they'd want to do that, and I know I'm a Bitcoin-centric person, but I seriously believe they're doing it all to tank the price of Bitcoin. I believe even everything that has been going on with other certain types of altcoins like Ethereum, I believe even that has been used to tank Bitcoin. Now you notice that inverse proportionality to the amount of Ethereum there is or the prices of Ethereum, the prices of Bitcoin, you'll notice that Ethereum has gone down significantly more than Bitcoin has. So there's obviously a relationship there somewhere. How's that relationship going? Probably as a result of investments that Chase Bank has done in Ethereum products. And this has helped to keep Ethereum up, but even then, the goal, I believe, of Ethereum and a lot of the altcoins is to literally somehow muddy the waters so ultimately it lowers the price of Bitcoin. And as I explained in the last telecast, there's no question that the prices have been manipulated to be able to go down. And they certainly have gone down as far as Bitcoin is concerned. And I believe they will go further because at some point there was a connection between the NASDAQ and the price of Bitcoin, the price movement of Bitcoin. It ended up being very, very similar. Now, it could have been through the exchanges that did this, but obviously some very important people realized that proportionality, and therefore realized that if they could tank NASDAQ and if they could tank the stock market, then they could probably tank Bitcoin along with it too. What's the purpose? To try to make people feel that Bitcoin is not worth anything. It's just one of those extra areas in the tech sector. But in fact, it isn't just an area in the tech sector. It's totally different. It is a totally different type of software. It is a type of pristine money that governments cannot change. They can't do anything to change it, except for occasional times like this. They can try to tank it by creating a panic, by creating some sort of a panic and making people go, ooh, massive inflation. We're going to go into hyperinflation. Remember, before the dollar goes into hyperinflation, you're going to hear about every other currency in the world going into hyperinflation. The euro is going to go into hyperinflation. The kroner is going to go into hyperinflation. The mark, the franc, the peso, every other currency there is in Africa and South America and everything, they're going to go into massive inflation before the dollar ends up going into massive inflation. Why? Because this is a gigantic casino. We are in a gigantic casino, and the house rules are made by the United States, with the exception of Russia and China. But other than that, the house rules are the United States and create all the different exchange rates for every currency. And so if they can do this, they are again manipulating the market. Now, Joe Biden and all of the members of Congress and the House and the Senate have an agreement with the oil companies. We'll help you get elected. You allow these prices to be there. Do you think that Joe Biden couldn't put a massive tax on the oil companies or freeze wages and prices or do something to stop the massive amounts of cost of petroleum? Of course he could do that. Is he going to do it? No. Because he promised that he wouldn't, and he has agreements with these people. So what are they doing? They're trying to tank the price of Bitcoin, and they've succeeded. And the good news is they're going to give all of us the greater ability to buy on a big dip. And I have no doubt that President Bukele of El Salvador is going to be taking advantage of this, because I believe that he's known that this is going to happen all along. But he is not a fortune teller. He doesn't know exactly how low Bitcoin is going to go, which is why he's been buying on the dip, but he hasn't been buying a lot of it. He hasn't been buying it. At this point, it's still probably less than 3% of the amount of taxes that they procure every year. And what if he ends up spending 10% of what they make on taxes on Bitcoin? That almost sounds like a fractional reserve. That's what banks are theoretically supposed to have, a fractional reserve of 10% of cash liquidity in case there's a run on the bank. Well, I would think Bukele is buying insurance, and he's also keeping that similar kind of fractional reserve. Maybe that's what he's heading towards. But the important thing in here is he has anticipated this. He has, and he is anticipating this. And I think pretty soon a lot of other countries are going to start to get wise to this as well. So just realize again, as I continually point out, there is Bitcoin and there's everything else in alt currency. Everything else, I hate to tell you, is based on, it's standing on quicksand. Will it create liquidity? Yes, there are people that are investing a lot of money into it. There are probably people that are what they call whitewashing, people that are heavily involved in Ethereum and products that are buying it, selling it, artificially creating volume. How can they do this? Because it's not regulated. That's how they do that. If they try to do that in the stock market, the SEC is going to catch them. But in this particular instance, it's not really regulated. They're encouraged not to do it, but that's the only way to get people to listen and think, wow, if there's a lot of volume on a stock, it must be worth something. this is the way it works. The dollar probably isn't much different, to be perfectly honest. Do I invest in things related to the dollar, like the stock market? Yes. Do I believe it's all on quicksand? Yes, I do, but I continue to invest. Do I invest in other types of products that are based on quicksand as far as the alt currencies, like Ethereum? Yes, I do. A little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit, because I do believe there's money to be made. Is it a Ponzi scheme? Yes. Is the dollar a Ponzi scheme? Yes, it is. I discussed the reasons for it in the last telecast on YouTube. I discussed that, yes, it's a Ponzi scheme, but it's a result of human greed, and this is how it works. What's fascinating about all of the other altcoins is what they have done is they have created this mechanism very, very similar to the Federal Reserve, where they are controlling the amount of their currency, their altcoin currency that is going in the market. In theory, I have heard talk that Ethereum actually burns. They actually buy, I guess some of the, I'm not sure how they do this through their so-called, their little Federal Reserve, mini Federal Reserve that they have for Ethereum. They actually buy with money certain amounts of Ethereum and burn it. Supposedly, we have to take their word for it. There's no accounting firm confirming it, but we just take their word for it, just like we just assume. But what happens every once in a while, just like every poker game, even though the United States is the house, they are the owner of the casino, but in every poker game, as Max Kaiser pointed out, which the man is obviously incredibly intelligent, every poker game at some point you're going to be called. You can bet everything you have on a certain hand, but at some point somebody's going to look at you and say, you know something, I think you're lying. And they're going to call you, and they're going to unfortunately lose. And there's going to be many hands. It's not over yet. But a good example of this is Russia and the Ukraine. Now, is war correct? No. Do I think Russia was right in invading the Ukraine? No, I don't. But let's look what led up to it. Back in the 80s or early 90s, an agreement was made, and it was said, whether it was in a formal agreement or not, it was said that the NATO would not move more than an inch past where they were now. Well, NATO has expanded considerably. In fact, NATO covers the good part of the western part of Russia. It covers it almost completely. All of these countries have basically worked their way. And then, of course, there is the Ukraine, which is basically the pawn of the United States. The United States has no intention of making them a NATO country, even though people in the Ukraine, there was talk about it in the early 2000s, people of Ukraine believe, oh yes, we're going to be part of NATO, but they know it's not going to happen because that's going to cause even more problems than what we have now. So Ukraine is a pawn. They have been a pawn. Are they a great government? No, they're not. Was there a coup in 2014 that was sponsored by the United States to control who was in that government? Absolutely, there was. So much for democracy. So much for democracy. Is there a tremendous amount of fascist elements in the Ukraine? The Azov Battalion. Every time they talk about the Odessa and they talk about the wars going on there, I always remember how the Azov Battalion burned alive about, I think it was hundreds of union protesters in a building. They burned them alive. That's the way they play. The United States condemned it, but really they continue to support the war because they're billed as a country that needs our help. I suppose they do. Is the war against Ukraine right? No, it isn't. But what happened is that their hand was called. The United States' hand was called. There was a lot of talks for the last 25 years from Russia saying, we've got to resolve this issue, we've got to resolve it. It was greeted by closed arms and empty ears on the part of the United States. It went on and on and on. And finally, the US said, well, if you do invade it, we're going to destroy and we're going to tank your economy. And so Russia said, well, I think you're bluffing. So they called their hand. They went into war. And yes, originally the ruble went down, but how did the ruble start to go up again? It's called an exchange. What happened is Western Europe now needs to pay Russia back in rubles. And how are they going to pay them back in rubles? They're going to have to buy those rubles. They're going to have to use their euros and any other type of currency they have, some of them possibly even dollars, to buy those rubles. And who determines the price of the ruble? Russia determines the price of the ruble. So of course that's going to lift their currency up. So I suppose they were right to call. Hopefully the war doesn't escalate past where it is now, but that's how things happen from nation to nation, and this is what's happening now. So an example of calling there, or example I should say of the exchanges. The United States has it worked out through the petrodollar, through Saudi Arabia, that everybody who buys oil in Saudi Arabia has to do it with the American dollar. So every single country in the world has to buy their petroleum through Saudi Arabia using the American dollar. How are they going to get those dollars? They're going to have to go to an exchange to get those dollars. And they go to the exchange to get those dollars, and who determines the price of the exchange? The U.S. government determines the price of the exchange. Are they going to charge too much? Well, if they charge too much, they may get everybody, really, really upset. So they have to there's a supply and demand issue there. So they're not going to charge too much, but they're going to charge enough to make sure that every other currency is less, because it costs so much more for them to buy petroleum than it does for the U.S. to buy petroleum. So then we have created a great method for making sure that the dollar is the highest currency. So mark my words, if there's going to be massive inflation in the United States, you're going to hear about it first in Europe, you're going to hear about it first in Africa and South America. And then you'll start to know, okay, now things are heating up. But the dollar is always going to stay on top because the exchanges are wrangling. And the same thing with the exchanges, the Gemini, the exchanges, Coinbase, Kraken, all of them are wrangling. What's going on? Okay, the people that own those exchanges are incredibly wealthy. Apparently those exchanges do better than even the stock market in terms of, or Schwab in terms of being able to exchange stock for goods. And really, a great deal of these, except for Bitcoin, a great deal of these altcoins or shitcoins are just like stocks. They're like securities. They're controlled by a separate entity within that security, and as a result, they're able to manipulate the prices, and they manipulate it by maybe cross-collateralizing it through Bitcoin. But remember, they tried that through the Terra Luna, and that's where it didn't exactly end well for them. And I think people are starting to realize, but I'm not discounting altcoins. They're going to come up again at some point, because the U.S. can only keep tanking, specifically trying to tank Bitcoin and all the other currencies as much as they possibly can. There are limits. But in the meantime, I believe it is specifically aimed towards Bitcoin. That is my Bitcoin-centric idea. Other people would say, oh no, they're trying to help the economy. They have no choice. They're trying to stem inflation. I realize that all the other Bitcoin people are telling me massive inflation because so many dollars have been printed all over the world. I have no doubt that that will be an issue, and is an issue probably very shortly, but right now that is not the issues. Are these the roaring 20s? Ask yourself. Are these like the roaring 20s? Weimar Germany from 24 to 29, even though they had massive inflation before, experienced incredible economic ability right before the crash of 29. Now, at that time, the United States wasn't extremely inflationary, because at that time, at least we were backed by gold. And that was the issue. But then, of course, it became extremely deflationary because whoever had cash after that was hoarding it and keeping it. Some of them were keeping it as far as gold because they thought, well, gold will be worth something, but then that was confiscated from them. Well, Bitcoin's a little bit more difficult to confiscate from people, especially if they do not have that Bitcoin in an exchange and they actually have it like a lot of other people do in a wallet, or they have what they call multi-sig, which is a very, very good idea, multi-sig, as I do and a lot of other people do, where you actually have a little bit in here, a multi-sig here, maybe another one across the country, another one in Europe, another one in a safety deposit box. So you can have either 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 5 to where you can actually go and get those different signatures and then get a hold of your Bitcoin. But it's very difficult for the government to confiscate it at that point. But at some point, mark my words, the United States is going to have to deal in Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is going to have to be eventually the reserve currency of the world, and it will be highly valued. So where does all this lead us? Consider that the Plunge protection team, which I talked about last week, the Plunge protection team has a tremendous influence, and in fact, they are the ones that are engineering this economic coup that is befalling us. They are the ones that understand that Bitcoin the price movement is related to NASDAQ. Either it was manipulated into that through the exchanges. Remember, all of these exchanges that are in the US are beholden to the United States and have to report about taxes. And since these exchanges are not regulated, God only knows what kinds of deals they have with either the US or the subordinates of the US, like Chase Bank, like Wells Fargo, like Bank of America. All of these people that are basically working for or towards the US and the Federal Reserve to be able to help money. And they have the ability to do all sorts of damage if they want, or create all sorts of ruckus, or as I say, the exchanges are wrangling, they're wrangling the exchanges, and they're doing a good job at it. But there's only so long that they can do this with Bitcoin, because again, Bitcoin has a maximum of 21 million Bitcoin. There's roughly 19,500,000 now in circulation, and gradually, I suppose, I'm not sure, it's probably over the next 150 years, there'll be less and less as Bitcoin raises and raises in its value. But make no mistake that the Plunge protection team has been very, very busy lately. And if you think that there's massive inflation, generally massive inflation means you'll have everybody being employed. And it means all of your friends will have bought cars and gadgets and houses and all sorts of things, will have speculated in all sorts of speculative things. Are they doing that now? Well, apparently not, because the prices are down on everything. Normally, when inflation is in effect, prices are up and they're going up and continue. Nope, they're down. Fascinating how that works. I know we would say it is the supply chain is down, which is true. And oil is in demand. Why? Because obviously the oil companies have seen to it that it's in demand. What happened with all the oil in the United States? What happened to all the oil in Texas and Alaska? What happened to all this oil in Venezuela, where all these teams were going and dealing with them? They realized, let's not worry about that right now. Let's keep these oil prices high. Let's keep our donors happy so we can get elected next election cycle. That's what's going on. That's called the Plunge protection team, and they've been really busy lately. So now, I guess what's really important is, how does this affect El Salvador? It affects El Salvador, I think, in a really, really great way. Well, number one, El Salvador is on the dollar. And not only that, the El Salvadorian people that are all over the world, mostly in the United States, Canada, some in Europe, they are the hardest working people in the world. They do all they can. They work so hard to keep money on the table, keep food on the table, keep money in their accounts, and pay money to their beautiful relatives that live in El Salvador. And as a result of them, the El Salvadorian economy is over 100% larger than it was 10 years ago, just with the dollar as it is now. And so, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons that President Bukele is, one of many reasons why a Bitcoin bond has not been fully developed yet and actually put on the market, because I really do believe that he wants to reward the people, that the diaspora, for the incredible amount of work that they've done, and they have put dollars into El Salvador. And since El Salvador, that is one of their main currencies, they're not going to have to suffer massive inflation like a lot of their neighbors may have to suffer at some point, unless their neighbors get smart and decide they're going to start getting into Bitcoin now as well. And if that happens, then at some point, then people throughout South America and Central America will start trading in Bitcoin and maybe not even as much in dollars. That could really, really strengthen economies, but don't let me get too far ahead of myself there. It's an exciting topic. But we have seen that we are looking at an agrarian society here, mostly El Salvador, with exception of the influx of money that comes from the diaspora. And then we're looking at all of the children that have incredible access now to education. Handicapped children, blind children, healthy children. I shouldn't make that division, but I only do it to express what incredible amount of heart that Bukele and the Bretton have for the El Salvadorian people, that they want to do all they can to develop their educational abilities. So in the next 10 years, we're going to have the best doctors. We're going to have the best lawyers. We're going to have the best economists there, mathematicians. I mean, for heaven's sakes, the people, the culture that a lot of the people have, their heritage is the Mayan culture, which was tracking, knowing where freaking galaxies were when other people in Western Europe were living in caves. Well, I have a feeling that this sort of thing is going to happen in El Salvador with the tremendous education that's going to be given the people. And with everything, coalescing, I really believe that El Salvador right now is perhaps one of the most important countries in the world. The Tele-Aviacion is the most important representative force in the world, and Bukele is certainly probably the most important president in the world. So I leave you with this. I think it's really happy times for El Salvador, and for those of you that are worried about massive inflation in the United States, I don't deny that it's going to come someday, but I don't think we're there yet. So with that, I wish you all a pleasant day, and I will see you next week. Thank you.